Hello kids, this is Mr. Whistler with your video lesson of the day, and today we will be talking about the Nullification Crisis. Before we do though, I want you guys to do this warm-up, and what I want you to do is take out a piece of paper. I want you to read this paragraph and I want you to answer this question. You have to write the question, but you do not have to write the paragraph. I'll go ahead and read it with you first. Expanding the boundaries of the United States was in many ways a cultural war as well. The desire of Southerners to find more land suitable for cotton cultivation would eventually spread slavery to these regions. Many Northern citizens were deeply concerned about adding more slave states. So Manifest Destiny touched on issues of religion, money, race, patriotism, and morality. These clashed in the 1840s as a truly great drama of regional conflict began to unfold. So the question is, why did Manifest Destiny cause a culture war between the North and the South? And if you read it again, you can see that they talk about the South and what they wanted and the North and what they wanted, and that's the answer. So many Northerners were concerned about the addition of territory that could become slave states, while many Southerners were in search of new lands for cash crops, especially cotton. All right, we have a couple of vocab words today. First one is suffrage, the right to vote. 8th grade voting and significance, it gives people a say in government. Our second word is secede. This is a repeat word. To withdraw from the Union. When a state leaves the Union, you can see from the picture. Now they don't physically leave, but they leave and start their own country. It weakens the country. All right. President Monroe decided to follow Washington's precedent and not run for a third term. So under President Monroe, he was president from 1816 to 1824, and it was called the Era of Good Feelings. And his legacy is the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said no other countries can come over to North and South America and start colonies. We would recognize the ones that are there, but no new ones can come, and that's still our policy. All right, the election of 1824 had 4 candidates. William H. Crawford was the official, from Georgia, was the official Democratic-Republican candidate. And then you had 3 favorite son candidates, and these 3 guys were backed by their home state. All 4 candidates were Democratic Republicans on paper. So you had Henry Clay, Mr. Compromise, from Kentucky. You had Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, and you had John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. Now remember, the 12th Amendment said that the vice presidential candidates would now run on a separate ballot. Well, it also said that to be elected president, you had to get a majority of the votes. So in this election, 1824, you needed to have 131 votes. That would have been a majority of the electoral votes to be elected president. So, out of these 4 guys, Jackson got 99, Adams 84, Crawford 41, and Clay 37. Nobody got the needed 131. So if that happens, the House of Representatives decides the election, much like a tie. Well, Henry Clay had a meeting with John Quincy Adams, and Clay, at the time, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. So he had a lot of influence in the House of Representatives, so he agreed to use his influence to help Adams defeat Jackson if, when Adams became president, that he would make Henry Clay Secretary of State. Now, Henry Clay kind of saw a pattern with what had been going on in the presidency. Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State, and Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State, and Adams was Monroe's Secretary of State. So he saw the Secretary of State position as a stepping stone to the presidency. So he wanted to be Secretary of State, and Adams liked this idea, and so he agreed. Well, it's not illegal to do this. This kind of stuff is done all the time in modern days, but it wasn't really done back in those days, and people didn't like it very much. They didn't like this little bargain they made. Well, when they did do the vote in the House, Jackson got 7, Adams got 13, Crawford got 4, and Clay didn't get any. So, if you look at the voting map, Adams got all these votes from the Federalist areas. Jackson took half the South, and Crawford took the other half. So, they didn't like this very much. When Jackson found out about it, he called it a corrupt bargain, and it kind of put a shadow over John Quincy Adams' presidency. So I found this picture online. This was kind of appropriate. POTUS stands for President of the United States. So this is kind of like a movie poster, if there would have been a movie about this. POTUS number 6, John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 1829, in The Corrupt Bargain, co-starring Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Well, Adams' presidency. He was officially a Democratic Republican, but in his heart of hearts, he was a Federalist. His dad was a Federalist, and his dad taught him. So see if what he wanted as president relates to what John Adams did. He wanted a strong national government. He wanted to build up the Navy, and he wanted the government to control the economy. So he did fine his first couple of years, but in the midterm elections, Adams' enemies took over both the House and the Senate. Well, as you know, when the opposite party of the president takes over both the House and the president can't get anything passed. So he couldn't get anything done. The corrupt bargain put a shadow over Adams' presidency, but he really made his mark as Secretary of State. If you'll remember, Madison actually is the one who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe gets credit for it because he's the president. But he was one of the best diplomats our country has ever had. And one thing that's unique to John Quincy Adams is after he lost his election and was not president anymore, he ran for Congress and served in the House of Representatives for 17 years or until he died. And he died at age 80. So this tells you a lot about John Quincy Adams. Like his father, he was a high character guy. He cared about the government, and they just ruled under their philosophy of government. All right, now this is really interesting. Now, I'm going to have a little commercial here. Now, John Adams, his dad, was from Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson, the third president, was from Virginia. Now, both of these guys were authors of the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th, 1776. Remember the conversation, you do it, no, you do it. Well, they were both involved in it. These guys were both friends, and if you'll remember, their political careers strained their friendship for many years. Well, after they retired, at some point, they started writing each other, and we're not really sure who started it, but they became really good friends again. Maybe even, best friends by some people's account through letters. Well, now this is really weird, but 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1826. It was signed July 4th, 1776. So 50 years to the day of the signing, John Adams lay on his deathbed. And he must have been thinking about his buddy, because his last words on July 4th, 1826 were, "Jefferson still lives," and then he died. What's kind of weird here is he dies on the 4th of July, exactly 50 years after they signed the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's weird, but the really weird thing is, what he didn't know was that his lifelong friend Jefferson had died on the exact same day just a few hours before him. So both Jefferson and Adams died on the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That is just really weird, and it's kind of a natural tribute to these two founding fathers. All right, so from 1816 to 1824, there was one party. They were the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, or today's Democrats. And during the election of 1828, the party split. So you still had the Democratic Republicans, but then half the people split into the National Republicans. Now these guys were probably really the Federalists, or the guys that believed in a strong central government. All right, now during the election of 1828, it was between Andrew Jackson and the sitting president, John Quincy Adams. Now this election was when mudslinging really got going. These two guys said so many mean things and kind of ridiculous things about each other. It was almost funny. Jackson said, "You kidnapped a young girl and sold her to the ruler of Russia." And John Quincy Adams was like, "Oh yeah? You used your sword to stab helpless citizens." So they would continue to say these types of things back and forth during the campaign. That's where mudslinging really started, and the politicians do that kind of stuff today. So Jackson was very well loved by the people. He won the Battle of New Orleans. They loved that. They loved the story about how he attacked those Spanish forts, and so he easily wins this election. 178 to 83. Well, contributions Jackson made as president. First of all, he expanded suffrage, or voting. If you remember, the only ones that could vote back in the day were white males older than 21 who owned property. Well, he got rid of that requirement where you had to own property, and that increased the amount of people that can vote tremendously. He also instituted the spoil system. If you understand government today, whoever is elected president cleans out the old people who worked in the White House and brings in all his own people that he wants in there. To the winners go the spoils. It's called the spoil system. Jackson started that. And then the other thing that he brought in was the nominating conventions. So today, if you want to run for president, there'll be 5 or 6 Republicans that go around campaigning around in each state, and each state votes for them, and after they're done campaigning, one guy will have gotten the most votes. Well, eventually they have a nominating convention where all the Republicans get together and they say, yeah, we want this guy to run for president. Well, the Democrats do the exact same thing, and in the general election, the Republicans nominee at their convention runs against the Democratic nominee at their convention. Jackson started the nominating conventions, and they're still done today. All right, the Tariff Crisis. Now, in 1828, right after Jackson was elected, Congress passed a very high tariff on manufactured goods from Europe. Well, manufacturers from the North loved the tariff because it made them more money. Southerners hated the tariff. They called it the Tariff of Abominations because it cost them more money. So these posters kind of illustrate why the Northerners liked it. Well, if you pass the tariff, it makes foreign goods more expensive because the foreign countries doing business in the United States have to pay a tariff and the countries that are already here don't. So people buy more U.S. goods. And because of that, northern industrial states profit from the increased business. Southerners hated it because foreign goods are more expensive. So people buy more U.S. goods. Well, European countries retaliate by buying less Southern cotton. The Southerners sold a lot of their cotton to European countries. And they were like, well, if you don't buy our goods, we're not buying your cotton. So this hurt the economy of the South. Their other option was to appease the European merchants in the South by continuing to buy European goods, even though the tariffs made them more expensive than the northern goods. So the Europeans were like, you're not buying our goods, we're not buying your cotton. So the Southerners were like, okay, we'll buy your goods. But they had to pay more for it, and it made them mad. They hated tariffs. So the South protests. John C. Calhoun, the now vice president, says that a state or a group of states had the right to nullify a federal law it considered against state interests. Now, if you remember, when we talked about nullification before, after the Alien and Sedition Acts, the states said they could nullify federal laws that were unconstitutional. Well, now they've changed their tune a little bit. Now they say they can nullify federal laws that they don't like. Well, some Southerners called for the Southern states to secede or leave the Union. Well, two questions arose. What if a state disagreed with the federal government? And did a state have the right to go its own way? So they started talking about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions again. Remember, Jefferson wrote these, every state has a natural right to nullify. The state's argument, since the federal government was a creation of the states themselves are the final authority of the constitutionality of federal laws. The alternative to state sovereignty or the states being in charge is to allow the Supreme Court or Congress to tell the people what our Constitution means and what orders we must obey. So which one of these two decides whether a law is constitutional or not today? It's judicial review in the Supreme Court. All right, so Jackson takes a stand. Nobody knew where Jackson stood on nullification. And if you'll remember, Jackson is a Southerner, but Jackson, even though he's a Southerner, he's also the president. And if you'll remember his personality, it's like when he's given a job to do, he gets it done no matter what. So is Jackson, what's the job of the executive branch? To enforce the laws. So Jackson's job is to enforce the laws, and this tariff is a law that Congress made. So is it in Jackson's personality to go with the South? Well, the states' rights people have a dinner, and they invite Jackson to this dinner to see where he stands on this issue. Well, when Jackson got up to speak, he looked right at John C. Calhoun, his vice president, and said, "Our federal union must be preserved." So Jackson took the side of the federal government. He's not going to let the government or the country fall apart under his watch. That's just not in his makeup. So Calhoun looked back at him and replied, "The Union next to our liberty most dear." And what he was saying was, the Union comes second to our freedom. Well, this crisis got worse. The Southern anger continued to build over the tariff. Now this next part right here is history repeating itself. Now this sounds very familiar to something that you've already learned. So in 1832, Congress passes a new lower tariff, hoping it would lower their anger. It didn't. This reminds me of the Sugar Act. Remember when Britain passed the Sugar Act and it actually lowered the tax on molasses to try to get the Americans to stop smuggling? Did it work back then? No. Did it work now? No. This is history repeating itself. Back then, during the Revolutionary days, England would do something, the Americans would do something to counter it. England would do something else, the Americans would do something to counter it. That's exactly what's going on here. Well, South Carolina passed the Nullification Act, said they could nullify whatever they want, and they refused to pay the tariff. And they threatened to secede. Well, Henry Clay, Mr. Compromise, comes to the rescue once again. Remember, he saved the country from war in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. Now he's come up with another solution to this problem. So to ease the tension, Jackson supported the compromise by Clay that would lower the tariff over several years. So what would happen is the North wanted this tariff to stay high forever to protect their business from foreign goods. The South hated the tariff. They wanted it to go away. So Clay's compromise was the first year it'll be this much, and then this year it'll be a little less, then this year it'll be a little less, until finally the tariff over several years goes away completely. Well, Jackson made sure the Southerners would accept. He persuaded Congress to pass the Force Bill. Now, the Force Bill allowed the president to use the military to enforce acts of Congress. South Carolina accepted, but then they voted to nullify the Force Act, and they said they won. So keep in mind that they were going back and forth here, just like they did during the Revolutionary days. This is history repeating itself. All right, here is the Nullification Crisis notebook. On this side, I want you to write about the Tariff of Abominations and really the reactions to it. They started talking about states' rights, and these people started to protest. The states have the right to nullify anything the federal government passes that they don't like, and they have the right to secede. And the tariff decreases over several years until it's gone. The Force Bill, the president can use the Army to enforce acts of Congress. Okay, I want you to glue the thinking map in here and take it and write an essay on the Nullification Crisis. Type it up and put it right here. So in 1828, the federal government created a very high tariff on imported goods. The North loved it because it helped them make more money. The South hated it because it cost them money. So because of the tariff, the South again started talking about states' rights. They said that they could nullify any federal laws they didn't like, and they could secede if they wanted to. They justified this because they created the federal government and because they should be the final authority. So they refused to pay the tariff. So Henry Clay came up with a compromise that said the tariff will decrease over several years until it's gone. So to force them to accept it, Andrew Jackson passes the Force Bill, which allows the federal government to use military to enforce acts of Congress. That's today's lesson, kids, and have a great day.